What are the best decks in Yu-Gi-Oh? Most crossover breakers. Big Dog, crossover breakers is not only going to introduce 3 new strategies, it's also going to change some other strategies that we know about, potentially make the meta, but more importantly, it's going to change a whole bunch of Yu-Gi-Oh cards that we are playing that's going to affect every single Yu-Gi-Oh deck. So in today's video, I pulled up my big boy pants and I researched every single Yu-Gi-Oh strategy that is impacted, and I'm going to be letting you know what I think is the best, all the way to crossover into the new realm. I ain't gonna lie, crossover into a new realm sounds pretty cool, but for the intents and purposes of this video, it's the opposite. It's not good. Also, I really did pull my big boy pants up. Look, I don't have the hoe shorts anymore. They're actual pants. Let's go ahead and jump on in. What's going on with y'all, Big Dog? And it is an amazing day for Yu-Gi-Oh! I hope that's your day. Phenomenal. But if it isn't, Big Dog, never ever let what happens at the beginning of your day ruin your bag, baby, the rest of the day. Today, Big Dog, like I said in the main video, we're going to be talking about the best Yu-Gi-Oh decks post crossover breakers. And the criteria is simple. Today, we are not only going to be talking about the 3 main strategies that come from this set, we're going to be talking about the implications that it brings to the table. Since both Maliss and Ryuji are going to be some of the most anticipated Yu-Gi-Oh strategies, you can already assume that players are going to be prepared for it. Big Dog, cards like Artifact Lancia, Evenly Matched, Forbidden Droplet, those are going to be a little bit stronger. I talked about it in my staples tier list. But another thing I will be accounting for is what these decks bring to the table. Really, really powerful combos, but more importantly, Dimension Shifter. Dimension Shifter. Dimension Shifter. Also, Big Dog, I included some strategies that you guys wanted me to talk about on this tier list. So if you guys have any other strategies you want me to talk about on the next tier list, I believe it's going to be Rogue, then let your boy know down below in the comment section. I'll be sure to talk about your Rogue strategies too. Let's go ahead and start off with Centurion. This has already been a really good deck. I mean, it's taken a Centurion for it to be competitive since Valiant Smashers. I know, I'm a genius. Joke king right here. I think even with the potential increased presence of cards like Dimension Shifter, Centurion will be fine. And it's mainly because of Centurion Auxilla not necessarily caring about Centurion cards getting banished. Also, the deck is really good against board breakers. Cosmic Blazar Dragon kind of solves that issue. I don't think much changes for this deck. It's still a really solid contender. Centurion washes away a lot of the new threats into the meta, kind of like how we tried to wash away our student loan debt. But unfortunately and fortunately, like our student loan debt, it's not going away. At least not for another Centurion. That was a joke at all of our expense. Just to give you guys a heads up, I have separated Snake Eyes from Snake Eyes Fire King because some people in the comment section were a little antsy. Your Snake Eyes right now has almost the worst of every world. It gets infinitely weaker. The Molcharmi cards are pretty solid against it. And it feels like Ryuji does that 1-card combo thing that Snake Eyes used to do, except better. Regardless though, you spent $600 million for this deck and it still is a solid contender. I think we're moving towards the Snake Eyes cards being phased out of the Yu-Gi-Oh card game, so this deck is on its last leg. But surprisingly enough, this deck has more to stand on than Rachel from Tower of God. I hate that girl. Stun. Woo! We could talk about Stun forever. Big Dog, I think there's some pretty big things we need to know about Stun. First of all, Runic Stun players, statistically, you were never winning a major event. I mean, it was just never in the cards. But with Dimension Shifter having an increase of play, potentially, and Artifact Lancia having a definite increase of play, alongside of cards like Evenly Matched, we're gonna see who's gonna get stunned this time around. I would put Stun into crossover a new round. Stun's biggest problem in modern Yu-Gi-Oh! Is more deck diversity. When there are multiple strategies that can compete, this deck tends to struggle because those strategies also tend to have overlapping traits to be able to counter stun. It can't hone on a potential target to stun, and eventually it gets stunned out of the game. I would not suggest playing this deck. See, I told you guys I'm a good guy. I'm secretly even getting you friends in the process. Now, Maliss is the first of few Yu-Gi-Oh strategies that does have crossover breakers implications. Maliss is a new Yu-Gi-Oh strategy that is built on link summoning, but more importantly, built on banishing banishing your Maliss monsters, paying life points, and bringing them right back. It's really good with cards like Dimension Shifter and automatically loses to Artifact Lancia. It's also a Cyberse and a Link deck, so prepare for the world of bussy code talkers with double attack and doing all the crazy stuff. I think despite not having its full support, Maliss is a solid contender. I think there are going to be two prominent factors to allow Maliss to be a really good Yu-Gi-Oh deck. The first one is Dimension Shifter and its playlines. Maliss actually does have the intricacy and the busted Yu-Gi-Oh cards to be able to beat some of the top decks. And it's a strategy that players can 100% bet their horses on that it's going to be stronger. I mean, after all, it is a deck build archetype. But two, and the most important factor we have to consider, is the waifu tax. Big dogs, I've seen the waifu tax do some crazy things to Yu-Gi-Oh players. It made Dragon Maids a contender. It made Trap Tricks one of the best decks in the format. There was a point in time where Trap Tricks was crazy good. Maliss will be good because there will be so many players playing the deck, it's bound to get success. And that will feed into the player's thoughts that it's actually a good deck. Overrepresentation, actually being a good deck, waifu status, that's a recipe for a strategy that's going to be at least in contenders for a long time. Now, in my last meta tier list, I had Unchained as the top dog. I had him as some boys that can fight. Bro, Unchained is the LA phase. You gotta squabble with it, brody. But the problem with Unchained is that we're moving to something a little less favorable. The cool thing about Unchained is that we were moving towards a format where players were starting to play the Charmies less, which made Unchained favorably better. But now that there's two more decks that can play 20 million hand traps and has to respect the Molcharmy cards, those are going to be played more. Combine that with Shifter, evenly matched. I still think that the deck is good, but I would drop it down to potentially dangerous. Unchained, or Fiend Pile, that's close to what we should call it now, is still a really good Yu-Gi-Oh deck. But if I were taking a strategy to the highest level of event right now, I would consider putting it to the side right now and playing something else until we can have a more soft Yu-Gi-Oh meta. Like I said, Unchained players, we're gonna cook. We just gotta wait a little bit. Next is Ryuji, and as you guys can see, we're talking about pure Ryuji. The thing that I really like about Crossover Breakers is that we got 3 new solid Yu-Gi-Oh decks. But with Ryuji, we actually have multiple solid Yu-Gi-Oh decks because this can be an engine in so many strategies. But at this current time, we're talking about pure. We'll talk about some of those other engine-like Yu-Gi-Oh decks a little bit later. I think Ryuji as a deck, it's not tinking the tink. To be fair though, it would be ridiculous to have 3 top-tier contending strategies all in one set. I think that'd be a little bit too much for us to be able to handle. But I think right now Ryuji is a solid engine that gives support to certain strategies that may be underserved. That's pretty dang cool. Now, Chimera has had a really interesting trajectory. It went from a Yu-Gi-Oh strategy that has pretty much disappeared out of the competitive circuit, and it's for good reason. Both the Molcharmy cards and Shifter are expected to completely cook this deck. But it did get a top at YCS Bologna. I don't think that that's enough to be able to wipe the sins of Chimera. I'm still going to put it in needs help because this is a strategy that has had everything for it. Fiendsmith, Azamina, and a host of other cards to make this deck incredibly competitive. But it is shown time after time again that those engines are probably better off used in a different deck. Melodious, the other disappointing deck. The only difference is that this deck isn't going to cost you a Full Metal Alchemist arm and leg. I mean, hell, this deck really doesn't cost anything disappointing. It's like what your parents thought of you jumping out of bed. I think Melodious is in the needs help category. What was really good about Melodious is that it was amazing against hand traps, but unfortunately, it's not as amazing against board breakers. And moving past the Crossover Breakers format, it is thought of that we're going to be playing more board breakers. That doesn't necessarily mean that that's the end of the world for this deck, but with no help in 2 sets and also not necessarily being a crazy good deck right now, I don't expect it to get better. Don't talk to me, guys. Tenpai Dragon is still a major problem. Somebody said that I don't talk about Tenpai Dragon enough, so I'm just going to sit here and you guys are going to let me know down below in the comment section how powerful is Tenpai Dragon. Yep. Those points have pretty much been all set already. Much love, big dogs. I want to go on record saying that I do love this deck, but there's not really much else to talk about it. It is the starting trend when it comes to Shifter Yu-Gi-Oh decks, and is going to be the ending trend when it comes to going second board breaker Shifter Yu-Gi-Oh decks. Hopefully. I actually think that Sprite is one of the more dangerous Yu-Gi-Oh strategies. Sprite is a deck that did not get hurt by any of the upcoming changes. In fact, it low-key got stronger, because being able to prevent your opponent from banishing cards and Dimension Shifter are a little bit stronger in the game. This deck can actually search, technically, and special summon Chaos Hunter. It's also decent against board breakers and can deal with decks that summon really little monsters. So Sword Soul did get some support through Ryuji. The deck can make a bet on the floor in Verugis by using the Ryuji engine. Problem, the deck needs to sacrifice more non-engine to be able to fit in the Ryuji cards, making it a huge clumpy Yu-Gi-Oh deck. I don't think that the deck is bad, but if we're talking about like easiest access to win games, yeah, Sword Soul can be a really good deck going first, like popping off, but suffers from a few things when going second against already established boards. Sword Soul players, do not heat me. I've played your deck for years. Ryuji does not fix any of the problems that Sword Soul has. It just makes it more of a glass cannon Yu-Gi-Oh deck. And I personally think that it's cool to see the deck get more inadvertent support, but the other deck's still 1 in 2 card combo. This deck needs 2.5 cards to be able to protect itself for its original combo. And it still don't get no Baron to floor. God dang. Now, Ritual Beast is one of those weird situations because it's a deck that has topped YCS events, but namely in Europe. It's also a deck that has the second most representation in other level events like regionals. I think the benefits of Ritual Beast is that it will still be able to summon really powerful monsters like Archnemesis Protos and shut decks down. It's also pretty much immune to Shifter. If anything, it gets stronger with Shifter. But with cards like Artifact Lancey expected to be sided in mass, I really can't ignore that. I still think it's a potentially dangerous deck, though I don't think it will build the deck to beat, or one of the decks to beat. Big dogs, I want to put Salamangreat in potentially dangerous so freaking bad. But I'm not gonna lie to you, Salamangreat reminds me of when I was a kid and we used to drive by McDonald's and I used to ask, can we go to McDonald's? And they asked, did you have McDonald's money? Do you have Nibiru Evenly Match and Mole Charming money? Oh, no. I'm not asking you about do you have money to play them. I'm asking you, do you have the resources to exchange with those commonly played cards? Oh, and Shifter. You don't? Oh, we'll cross over to a new realm. There is one thing I want to point out with both Sword Soul and Salamangreat on this tier list. They are not bad decks at all. But I think when it comes to being able to top a YCS, we're not going to see these decks in the top bracket. I promise you, big dogs, they will be a lot higher on a different tier list. But as far as this tier list, the best decks, can't cut it. Whitewoods is a really interesting strategy because I think Whitewoods is in the needs help. Now, a big reason why I think that Whitewoods got a lot of play is a big reason why I think Maliss is going to get a lot of play. Look, man, I'm not saying that Yu-Gi-Oh players don't need help. You guys obviously do. But I do understand Yu-Gi-Oh players, and the waifu tax is crazy real. I think that Whitewoods will be played a lot less. And yes, it's because of Maliss. To be fair though, Whitewoods does have a little bit less to offer in this particular upcoming format. While it is still a strong Yu-Gi-Oh deck, it hasn't been supported like some of the others to make it a proper meta Yu-Gi-Oh deck right now. Yubel, guys, and this is a bold take. Look, man, I think players have been plotting on Yubel's downfall. They've been plotting like how Kendrick been plotting on Drake. They be plotting like how the YNs be plotting with a PS4, some blue chews, and protection. Oh, they plotting. And it actually may come into fruition. Yubel is not one of the big three. This pretty much did have its time in the making. Yubel is a solid Yu-Gi-Oh deck. But some of the biggest Yubel problems are going to be threatened with this potential meta. And while I do think it's going to be a solid deck, I wouldn't be surprised to see it top a few. It's actually been dwindling in those specific tops. And it's for good reason. The meta is going to be moving away from some of those graveyard reliant decks. Memento is in the same spot as Unchained and Yubel. Still a really good strategy, but you gotta move it down to potentially dangerous. Bro, I'm telling you, once players stop playing Shifter, we can get it cracking with the mean team. But until then, you gotta kind of lay low and see how the meta plays out. Rescue Ace ain't doing terrible. This deck actually has more ways to play against Shifter than most, so I'm gonna put it in potentially dangerous. I also absolutely love that this deck can be built for $50, and I just so happen to have made a profile for it. Labyrinth is easily one of those contender Yu-Gi-Oh decks. This deck is pretty good in the grind and pretty good against a lot of the new strategies that's coming out. I would put Dinomorphia in needs help. Some of the best board breakers in the game that players are going to be using is pretty decent against Dinomorphia, but I would not count it out as a solid budget Yu-Gi-Oh deck. Mermail does technically get Ryuji cards, which means it can make Verugis. Now that does add another layer, but Mermail was already doing decently fine. The only problem is that it's graveyard reliant. I'm gonna put it in potentially dangerous. And as you guys can see, the potentially dangerous strategies do have some question marks around them, but they all have been pretty decent Yu-Gi-Oh decks. Now, you guys have told me to talk about Battle Wasp. Goodness, I've waited to another tier list. Battle Wasp is Bro, this deck's not it. Battle Wasp is not doing anything in this meta when it comes to competitive best Yu-Gi-Oh decks. I'm sorry, big dogs. While I think that Battle Wasp or the Insect deck is a pretty decent Yu-Gi-Oh deck, it's not powerful enough to be able to keep up right now. Fire King, I still think is one of the best decks in the game. I actually think that Fire King Snake Eyes has solidified itself as better than the Snake Eyes Azamina deck, and it's mainly because this deck has multiple layers. Despite it being a little bit weaker to cards like Shifter, this deck almost doesn't care. It still finds a way to win. This deck puts your opponent on, hey, you need to have those particular responses. If not, well, I'm just gonna cook you anyways. Unfortunately for now, the format still runs through Snake Eyes Fire King. I do think that Voiceless Voice is potentially dangerous. Yo! As you guys already know, Dimension Shifter is not this deck's friend, but Voiceless Voice can play the Ryuji cards, which is searchable through this deck, and it also is really good with board breaker cards, as opposed to hand traps. I think that Exodia is a contender. This deck is still really good going into the next meta. It's a deck that's unaffected by Dimension Shifter, and ironically, some of the best decks in the game still need their spell cards to operate, and Exodia takes that away. I think that Dino might surprise people, and the biggest reason is because Sword Soul Ryuji requires a lot of engine. Where are you going to fit your hand traps? Well, Dino has always been a pretty good deck at being able to play a ton of engine because it's a board breaker like deck. I actually want to put Dino in potentially dangerous. Like, I think it could be all right. Now, guys, I'm not going to lie. This could be me coping. The deck isn't great against Dimension Shifter. It also isn't great against Artifact Lance. Okay, I'm coping, but hey, look. Know that I'm top tier coping right now. I promise you, Dino community, I'ma build the best Dino deck that nobody has ever seen. And we gon' live the dream again. Dino's best deck. If you guys seen what happened at YCS Bologna with Kashtira, I don't think that it's done just yet. Being able to have an engine that's good going first and going second, while also ripping cards out of the opponent's extra deck is going to be huge. With that being said, Kashtira has another layer with the Fiendsmith cards, but not necessarily needing those cards to be able to succeed. I think overall, this is one of the strongest decks in the format and is a top contender, whether you're using Kashtira as an engine or you're using it as a full-fledged deck. To be honest, Kashtira could probably be here when the dust settles, but for right now, I think it's going to be a solid Yu-Gi-Oh deck. Floowandereeze, people think that I hate Floowandereeze. You couldn't be more wrong. But as far as one of the best decks, let it go, bird players. Let it go. Okay, to be honest, Floowandereeze, if these had to be ranked, by the way, none of these are. Floowandereeze is probably like right here. It's good. It's a good deck. Just unfortunately in this Yu-Gi-Oh meta, not good enough. Yugioh, I think if these were ordered, I think Yugioh may be the second best Yu-Gi-Oh deck, because that can play Shifter, but it also can play around Shifter, the qualities that most of these Yu-Gi-Oh decks have, but is also ridiculously powerful. It is the strongest deck out of crossover breakers and can make some waves. I think Exo Sister is definitely crossover into a new realm. While there are decks with graveyard manipulation, when it comes to the best decks in the game, I would almost bet my bottom dollar that 0 Exo Sister decks would top any YCS this format. It needs formats where decks touch the graveyard more than Yu-Gi-Oh players touch the shower, and it needs a significant amount. And I think that Goblin Biker is, I would put it in potentially dangerous. I think that this deck can be a contender depending on how far Yugioh goes. Like, for example, if Yugioh becomes the #1 deck in Yu-Gi-Oh, tier 1, like taking up the spots that Fire King then used to, then I think this deck can be a solid contender. Even when it isn't playing against an XE deck, it's still really good. But if Yugioh sits on that #2 or #3 spot, or probably even goes down to contender, this is still one of those potentially dangerous decks, always looking for the wave. And that's what I think are going to be the best Yu-Gi-Oh decks coming up into this format. I can't wait to see what I get right, what I get wrong, and how YCS Anaheim develops. Of course, big dog, if you want to see more amazing content, you already know what to do. Be sure to check out these so I can catch you on the next one.